walked into the chapel with the kind of silence you only learn after years of being told. Your voice is too loud for the room. My heels barely echoed against the polished floor, and yet every step felt heavier than the last I had parked 2 streets away, not because I had to, but because it felt appropriate. Like I shouldn't arrive too close to people who spent half my life trying to pretend I didn't exist. The funeral was already underway. I wasn't late, but no one was waiting for me either. That had been the case for years. The room was filled with familiar faces that had become strangers long ago. Aunts with hair done too tightly for mourning. Uncles who could never look me in the eyes after what they said about me at family dinners. Cousins who used to play with me before their mothers told them not to. I saw all of them, dressed in quiet grief, whispering condolences like it was a performance they had practiced together. I stood at the door for a moment. No one turned, not one person acknowledged me. It was as if the air shifted to make space around me, but no one wanted to fill it. I walked to the last row and sat down, alone. I watched the casket from a distance, my father's name carved in gold. He had died 10 days ago. A sudden heart attack, they said. I had found out from a newspaper article, not a call, not a message, not even a mistake. Just a headline. Local businessman David Renshaw dies at 62. I stared at it for hours before I allowed myself to cry. Even in death, they had managed to keep me out of the announcement. I suppose I should have expected it, after all. They had spent a decade rewriting the narrative to erase me from it entirely. Growing up, I used to believe my father loved me. I clung to the way he tucked me in as a child, the times we watched old movies together, the sound of his laugh when I got the punchline before he did. But then came his new wife. She moved in when I was 13 and wasted no time marking the borders of her territory. Slowly, he pulled away, my things disappeared from the living room, my photos came off the walls. My birthday dinner was forgotten 1 year. And when I asked why, he said, "Oh, Camille, we thought you were with your mother this week." I wasn't. I had been home. Weaned up by the time I was 19, I stopped trying. I went to college on scholarships, worked 2 jobs, and learned how to survive without the kind of love that's supposed to come unconditionally. When people asked about my parents, I lied. I said my father lived abroad, that we spoke occasionally. It was easier than explaining that he lived 20 minutes away and hadn't called in 3 years. Now, sitting there in that chapel, I realized nothing had changed. The woman next to me leaned slightly away, not even pretending not to notice me. The family tree had been pruned to their convenience, and I had been the dead branch they cut away. Still, I had come not for closure, not for forgiveness, but because I wanted to see with my own eyes how far the performance would go. I wanted to hear the words they'd used to describe him and who they pretend mattered. I wasn't surprised they didn't mention me. What startled me, though, was how much it still hurt. I had built an entire life outside of this, a life that mattered. But something about watching people grieve a man who had thrown me away like a forgotten letter still stung. The pews were packed and still, there was no place for me, not emotionally, not symbolically, not even practically. I noticed there were printed programs on every seat except mine. A subtle touch, maybe an accident, or maybe not. I kept mine folded in my coat pocket. I had brought my own kind of program, not a eulogy, not flowers, just the truth in paper. The kind that matters in courtrooms more than in confessionals. My fingers brushed over the sealed envelope tucked beneath my scarf, his handwriting on the front. The updated will. He had sent it to me 2 weeks before he died, unprompted, unsigned except for the final page with a short note. "I want you to have what they tried to take." I hadn't responded. I didn't know what to say to a man who remembered me only when it was too late, but I brought it anyway, and I sat there, watching the performance unfold, not with anger, but with a stillness I had never known before. I didn't belong in their story. That was fine because I was about to rewrite the ending, not with rage, not with revenge, just with presence, because despite their best efforts I was here, and they were going to see me. The ceremony dragged on like a play that everyone had rehearsed except me. The minister recited scripted condolences, the same ones you hear at every funeral, adjusted slightly to suit the man in the casket. Words like respected, devoted, pillar of the community, all falling like soft, polished stones onto the polished floor. My father had always been good at polishing the version of himself he wanted people to see. Even in death, it seemed his image was curated, controlled. I watched as people walked up to speak. My uncle, his brother, talked about their childhood, how David was always a responsible one, the driven one, the one who never gave up on family. I almost choked on the irony. Then, my cousin, the golden boy of the next generation, got up and talked about the lessons Grandpa David taught us all. I wondered when that happened. As far as I knew, he hadn't visited since he was 12 still. I sat there, motionless until I saw her rise. My stepmother, wearing black like mourning was stitched into her bones. She glided up to the front, like a queen assuming her throne, tissues in hand, the very image of grief. But I recognized the gleam in her eyes, not grief, triumph. She adjusted the microphone and began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, delicately, as though the weight of her sorrow made her fragile. But the words that followed cut clean through the air. David was a man of loyalty, she said, of truth and of blood. He built his life around his family, and he never let go of the ones who truly stood by him, even in his final days. His greatest sadness wasn't his illness, it was that some who should have been close were not. The audience nodded solemnly, as if they'd carried the burden of his supposed heartbreak. And as we gather here today, she continued to honor his memory. I feel it's important to say, the real daughter he loved is not here with us. She couldn't be. Her eyes swept the room slowly, dramatically, before landing somewhere just past me. But we carry her in spirit. The room hummed with murmurs of agreement, the kind people make when they don't want to question a statement, but also don't want to seem impolite. I didn't move. Not at first. Her words were not just a dismissal, they were a burial of their own. Another attempt to lay me to rest in absence, to erase me from the record in front of 100 people who likely didn't even remember I existed. In the first place, she was performing a final revision of the family story, one where I had never been real. And yet, I sat there, breathing. I wasn't supposed to be there. That much was clear. But that envelope in my coat, that was supposed to be here, my father had made sure of it. Maybe not out of love, but out of guilt or fear, or one last grasp for redemption. Either way, it was mine now, and it was time. I waited until she stepped down and the minister returned to close the ceremony. Then I stood. One small movement, one moment of sound in a room wrapped in false silence. Heads turned, whispers began. I took a breath. My coat shifted as I stepped into the aisle, the paper still tucked tight against my ribs. As I walked, I saw my stepmother's smile falter. Her hands clenched around the crumpled tissue. She knew I didn't stop at the pulpit. I didn't grab the microphone. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked past the family pews, all eyes on me now, and stopped to the lawyer seated near the front. He was a small man with large glasses, the kind who always looked like they were running late. I placed the envelope in his lap. For the record, I said, my voice calm and steady, I believe you'll want to review the most recent version. The lawyer blinked, then unfolded the flap. His eyes scanned the handwritten pages. A moment later, his face changed, the kind of shift you only see when something sacred and inconvenient is revealed. Gasps filled the air before I even reached the back of the room again. My father's voice, written in ink, now echoed louder than the organ or the choir. He had named me Camille Jordan Renshaw as his sole beneficiary, dated 3 weeks before his death. Signed in his unsteady but unmistakable hand. I didn't watch their faces. I didn't need to. I could feel the unraveling behind me, the collapse of a lie held too long, a truth buried too deep, and I, the ghost they tried to forget, had returned, not to haunt them, but to remind them I had always been alive. And now, seen, I stood just past the exit, not yet stepping into the sunlight behind me. The room was unraveling. My stepmother was whispering furiously to the lawyer, her voice climbing an octave with every sentence, her polished composure melting into desperation. She grabbed at the papers, but he held them firm, already aware of the implications. People weren't clapping anymore. They were staring, questioning. Even the relatives who had smiled at her on arrival were inching away, shifting in their seats, recalibrating where their loyalty lay now that the story had changed. It was fascinating to watch in a detached kind of way for so long. I had wanted their acknowledgement, their approval, but in that moment, all I felt was a strange kind of emptiness, not sadness, not triumph, but clarity, like waking up in a room you didn't realize you had fallen asleep in. Outside, the cold air hit me. Winter in Maryland was always sharp this time of year, but I welcomed it. It was real, unfiltered. It didn't pretend to be warm. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I ignored it. I knew what it would be, messages from cousins pretending they had always supported me. Old friends of my father's suddenly remembering how close we'd been. Some would be outraged. Some would beg forgiveness. Some would try to sell sympathy like it could be traded for a slice of inheritance. Let them. The truth was, I hadn't come for money. I hadn't even come for revenge. I had come for the simple, unbearable need to be seen, to exist in the record, and now I had that, in his own words, scrawled in his own hand. My father had written me back into the story, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of fear. But he did it, and now, it was sealed. I walked slowly, snow crunching beneath my boots, past the rows of parked cars lined like tombstones on either side of the chapel. My heels hurt, my fingers were numb, but I felt delight. When I reached the corner, I turned and looked back one last time. The door of the chapel opened. My stepmother stood there, framed by the shadow inside. She didn't shout. She didn't move. She just stared, her mouth tight with fury and something else I couldn't quite read, disbelief. Maybe, or fear. She looked smaller now, less like the iron figure who'd ruled the family with her smile, and more like a woman who just realized the walls she built weren't made of stone, but paper. And I didn't wave, I didn't nod. I simply turned the corner and disappeared from her sight, just as she had always wished, but not in the way she had planned that night. I slept for the first time in years without dreaming of being erased, and, in the morning, I made coffee, sat at my tiny kitchen table, and opened a new notebook. I didn't know yet what I'd write, but this time the story would be mine from the beginning. I stared at the blank page for a long time. It didn't intimidate me, not like before. I used to fear the silence, the space where words didn't yet exist. It used to echo the way they ignored me, the way my name wasn't spoken, the way chairs were filled around the holiday table while mine sat mysteriously missing. But now the emptiness wasn't hollow, it was waiting for me, for my voice, for the version of the truth that no one else could write but me. I didn't start with the funeral. I didn't even start with my stepmother. I started with the way my father held my hand when I was 6 and taught me how to write my name in cursive. How he told me names mattered because they outlasted everything else. I wrote about the days when I still believed I was his daughter, not just in blood, but in heart. I wrote about the shift, the day she moved in, and his eyes started to gloss over when I spoke. The way the silence grew louder every year. The way the phone stopped ringing. The birthday cards stopped coming, the visits were too complicated. I wrote until the sun moved across the window pane and cast long shadows on the floor. I didn't stop for lunch, I didn't stop for the messages that piled up on my phone from lawyers, from relatives, even from her, especially from her. I didn't need to hear what excuse she would create. I didn't need to know what version of me she'd try to repaint to save face, because now, the truth was already spoken, and it wasn't hers to control anymore. That night, I read the will again, not for confirmation, but for peace. The language was clumsy, clearly rushed, but in every word I heard his voice again. Camille will know what to do. That line haunted me. I didn't know if it was trust or a final attempt at repair, but it didn't matter because I did know what to do. I made a list. First, decline the money, not because I was noble, but because the inheritance they worshipped had always been poisoned. I wouldn't touch what was meant to silence me. I had a job, a life, a home. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I wanted nothing built on their erasure of me. Second, write everything, not as revenge, but as release. I carry my truth on pages, not on my back. Third, vanish, not from the world, but from their world. No more waiting for invitations. No more hoping for a place at tables that were never mine to begin with. The next morning, I mailed a letter to the lawyer, a handwritten response, just like the will, simple, direct, final. I acknowledged my father's decision. I will not contest it. I seek no property, no finances, no further communication. Let this serve as closure, not for you, but for me. I signed it with my full name, Camille Lynn Harper. The name they tried to forget. The name that now stood alone, and as I dropped the envelope into the mailbox, I felt it, a strange, almost terrifying sense of weightlessness. For years, I thought being disowned would destroy me. But now, I realized the truth. I was never theirs to begin with. I belonged to no one's narrative but my own, and finally, I had started writing it. That winter, I didn't go back home, if I could even call it that. I stayed in a small apartment I rented near the edge of the city, where the heater clanked at night and the neighbors played music too loud. But for the first time, the walls didn't feel like confinement, they felt like choice. I chose silence, I chose peace. I chose to no longer ask to be loved by people who only ever loved the version of me that didn't speak. The days passed. In quiet rituals, I lit candles in the evening, not for religion, but for grounding. I kept a photo of me and my father when I was little, before the woman with the red lipstick and sharp tongue moved in and made everything conditional. I didn't hate him, not really. What I felt was more complicated. It was grief, but not for his death, for the abandonment, for the choice he made to forget me while he was still alive, for the apologies he never gave until he was on his deathbed, writing a will that was more confession than correction. People tried to contact me. Some cousins, who had once laughed with my stepmother, shared posts about family unity, now sent awkward messages. I had no idea. We should catch up sometime. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I finally understood that I wasn't required to be available just because someone now felt guilty. Guilt is not a bridge, it's just a mirror. And I was done being the reflection. One afternoon in January, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence. Written in my stepmother's spiky cursive, "You should have. Stay quiet." I laughed. It was so her. A warning disguised as concern. A last attempt to remind me of my place, the silence, the back row, the invisible daughter. But it was too late. The truth had been spoken. Not loudly, not with vengeance, but with unwavering finality. I didn't respond. I didn't even keep the letter. I watched it burn in the sink, the smoke curling up like the last lie leaving my life. I kept writing, every day. Not just about the funeral, but about every memory I tucked away in the corners of my mind. The birthdays they skipped. The times I watched my father hold her children like I was never enough. I wrote about how I once thought I had to earn love, and how I now knew that some people love only what they can control, and call it family. I submitted a piece to a small literary magazine. It was published under a pseudonym. It didn't need to be traced back to me. I didn't need the recognition. I just needed the words to live somewhere outside of me, so they wouldn't run inside. That spring came. The snow melted, and I stood at the edge of a small lake one morning, watching the water ripple. I took off my shoes. I let the cold bite at my toes. I closed my eyes and whispered to the version of me that once waited at doors that never opened. "You're not missing anymore. You're just free, not forgiven, not avenged, not redeemed. Just free." A few weeks later, as the city thawed and the morning frost gave way to wet sidewalks and the smell of earth, I received another letter, this time from the lawyer. It wasn't urgent, just paperwork, a gentle reminder that there were still assets in my name, accounts untouched, options on the table. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. I had almost forgotten that I was now the legal heir to everything my father had left behind, but somehow that truth no longer felt like a reward or a prize. It felt like a coat that didn't fit anymore. I had walked out of that funeral with nothing, and I had been lighter for it still. I went through the documents, not because I wanted anything, but because I needed to finish what was started. To close the door entirely, with intention. The house, the cars, the investments, I signed most of them away, sold a few, donated others. I kept only one thing, my father's old leather journal. Tucked away in a box at the bottom of the list of possessions, it still smelled like him, faintly of tobacco and cedar and something else I couldn't name. I didn't open it right away. I was scared, I think, scared it would be empty, or worse, full of more justifications. But one rainy night, I finally did. His handwriting greeted me like a ghost. The first few pages were notes, business lists, numbers. Then, in the middle of the journal, a single paragraph, dated 3 years before his death. "I saw Camille today in town. She didn't see me. She was walking with a scarf around her neck, the same color her mother used to wear. She laughed at something. I had forgotten that sound. I don't know why I didn't go to her. I was ashamed. I chose wrong. And I don't know how to fix that. Maybe I can't." I closed the book and pressed it to my chest. I didn't cry, not then. But I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an understanding that some silences come from weakness, not malice. That maybe he didn't erase me because he hated me. Maybe he erased me because he couldn't face what he had done. That didn't make it okay, but it made it human. In early May, I returned to the cemetery, not for a ceremony, just to stand by the headstone that bore his name and hers. Side by side, one etched with false grief, the other with performance. I brought no flowers, just the journal. I didn't say much, just stood for a while. Then I bent down and buried the journal beside the grave, deep in the soil. Not out of spite, but because I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need to hold his shame. I had carried it long enough. I whispered one thing before I left: "This is the last time I come here as your shadow." From that day forward, I stopped explaining myself to anyone. I stopped dimming my voice to make others comfortable. I stopped sitting in back rows out of habit. I stopped answering texts that only came with guilt attached. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was writing more, walking more, laughing more. And one evening, on a rooftop with new friends who didn't know my history, someone asked me what my family was like. I paused, then smiled. "Complicated," I said. "But I'm learning to be my own." And in that moment, I realized I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was simply Camille. And that was enough. That summer, I moved into a small apartment in a quiet part of the city. It wasn't grand, and it certainly wasn't what anyone in my family would have considered a step up. But it was mine. The walls were bare at first, but slowly I filled them with fragments of who I truly was. A thrifted mirror with a crack I found charming. A photo I took by accident that captured the sunset in a way no one could recreate. A bookshelf lined not with heirlooms, but with memories I chose to keep. It was the first time in years I looked around a room and saw only reflections I recognized. I didn't tell anyone where I had moved. There were no announcements, no forwarding addresses left behind. The phone calls eventually stopped. The last message came from my stepmother. something short and condescending, accusing me of being dramatic and cutting myself off for attention. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. That was the difference now. I didn't feel the urge to defend my silence. Some truths are loud enough on their own. One afternoon, as I watered the little plant on my windowsill, I caught my reflection in the glass. For a moment, I didn't recognize a woman staring back, not because she was a stranger, but because she was finally real. There was a calmness in her shoulders, a steadiness in her gaze. She didn't need validation. She didn't need applause. She had survived being erased and rewrote herself from the ashes. I began volunteering on weekends at a local shelter, helping women get back on their feet after being pushed out of places that once promised them love. I didn't talk about my story, not at first, but I listened to theirs. And in every tremble of the voice, in every confession whispered through shame, I saw echoes of my own past. That's when I realized pain makes us solitary, but healing makes us sisters. One night, a younger woman sat beside me and said, "You always look like you've figured it out." I laughed, not out of arrogance, but out of honesty. I told her I hadn't figured it out at all. I just stopped trying to belong in places that asked me to shrink. In the quiet that followed, I thought about my father again, not the man from the speeches or the inheritance or the grave, but the man who once held my hand on a carousel when I was 6, the one who said I was brave. I chose to remember him like that, not because he earned it, but because I needed to hold on to the parts of him that made me good. And maybe that's what forgiveness really is. Not letting people off the hook, but setting yourself free from the weight of their decisions. Years from now, someone might ask me why I never brought up my family in conversations, why there are no photos, no mentions, no reunions. I'll probably smile and say something simple, like, it just wasn't the kind of love that lasts. But deep down, I'll know the truth. I wasn't meant to carry that story forever. I was meant to end it, and I did, not with revenge, not with anger, but with presence, with wholeness, with the quiet, radical act of continuing to live, beautifully, fully, and unapologetically. Because in the end, I wasn't the daughter who got left out. I was the daughter who walked out and never looked back. It's been 3 years now. 3 winters since the funeral. Since I stood at the back of that chapel and watched my family applaud a lie, sometimes on quieter evenings. I still remember the way my stepmother's voice echoed off the walls when she said I wasn't there. When I was, I remember the sharpness in her tone, the certainty in her words, like she truly believed she could erase me just by pretending I never mattered. But what she never understood was that being invisible doesn't mean being gone. And silence, when chosen, can be the loudest answer of all. I never returned to the old house. I never walked those halls again. Never stood in the room where I once practiced piano with trembling fingers while my father stood at the doorway and said nothing. I left all of it behind, not just the place, but the ache that used to come with remembering it. Healing didn't arrive like a sudden light. It came slowly, almost unnoticeably, through days where I didn't think about them, through meals I ate alone without feeling lonely, through the realization that peace is not the absence of pain. It's the decision to stop feeding it occasionally. I get letters from people I barely knew, cousins, old neighbors, distant friends of my father. They write with words like I always thought it was wrong, or I never knew the full story, or I'm sorry we didn't do more. I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't reply, not because I hold anger, but because I've learned that closure doesn't always come in conversations. Sometimes, closure is a locked door you walk away from and never touch again. The will was never contested. After the shock wore off, the rest of the family went quiet. I suppose they understood there was no use. Or maybe they were just too ashamed to face me again. Either way, the silence suited me. I didn't want their apologies. I wanted my life back. And I got it. I opened a small bookstore downtown. Something I dreamed of for years but never said out loud. It's not the most profitable business, but I've never been richer in spirit. I fill the shelves with stories that make people feel seen. Books about complicated families. About quiet revenge, about women who chose themselves. And some days, a woman walks in with tired eyes, picks up a novel, and tells me softly, "This one feels like it was written just for me." I always smile and say, "That's how you know it's the right one." Sometimes, I think about the kind of woman my stepmother hoped I'd become: bitter, small, begging for scraps of approval. And then I look at the woman I actually became, strong, whole, invisible to no one. I didn't get there by accident. I got there by surviving her. On the anniversary of my father's death, I lit a candle, not for him, but for me, for the girl I used to be, the one who sat quietly at every holiday, hoping someone would look her in the eye, the one who waited for a seat at the table, for a nod. For a moment, I lit that candle and whispered, "You don't have to wait anymore." And I swear, for the first time in my life, I felt her let go of me. I'm not the kind of person who needs to be remembered in the stories they tell now. Let them keep their versions. Let them twist the truth and polish the names and pretend. They were blameless. I don't need the last word, I just need the last page. And mine is written in ink they'll never erase. I used to think justice came with noise. With gavel strikes, with raised voices, with dramatic exits that left the room speechless. But I've come to understand that the deepest justice is often quiet. It's the kind that doesn't beg to be seen. It just is, like the stillness that comes after a storm. When the sky doesn't need to prove it rained, it simply shows the broken branches, the washed streets, the air cleared of lies. There was a time when I would have given anything just to hear my father say, "I'm proud of you." But pride spoken under pressure is just another disguise for guilt in the end. He did the one thing I never expected. He told the truth. Not to my face, not with warmth, but on paper with ink in the final version of his voice, and maybe that's all he had the courage for, maybe that's all he thought I was worth. But it was enough. What matters now is that I don't stand at the edge of my story anymore. I'm not the afterthought, not the shadow behind family portraits or the name skipped in introductions. I am the one who stepped out of the back row, the one who spoke without shouting, the one who left not in anger, but in clarity. I don't carry the will with me, it's in a drawer somewhere, forgotten. What I do carry is the way that moment felt, when every head turned, when silence gave way to recognition, when I said I'm here, and the room, for the first time, believed me. I built a life far away from the old one, but not out of fear, out of choice. I no longer visit graves hoping for closure. I plant things instead, lavender, tomatoes, rosemary. I've learned that growing something from dirt is a much better use of time than mourning what was buried in it. I've made peace with the idea that some apologies never come, some love is conditional, and some families are just the first place. You learn how to survive being unloved. But I also learned this. You are allowed to choose new people. People who see you without having to be convinced. People who don't weigh your worth against your obedience. People who don't call it love when it's just control dressed in sentiment. These people exist, I promise. Sometimes they come quietly. Sometimes they walk into your bookstore and stay past closing. Sometimes they love you with no backstory attached, and one day, you look around and realize this is the family I waited for. I haven't spoken to my stepmother since the funeral, last I heard. She moved to Florida. She sent a card once. A vague apology wrapped in religious quotes. I didn't respond, I didn't need to. That part of the story is over. Let her write her version in peace, I'll keep mine. Not out of spite, but out of truth, my truth. Untouched, unpolished, mine. I still think about that day, the chapel, the cold air, the stunned faces, but I don't replay it with pain anymore. I replay it with power. Because that was the day I was no longer the girl they forgot. I was the woman who remembered herself. They buried my father. But I rose. I rose not as a symbol of revenge or bitterness, but as someone who had finally outgrown the need for proof. Proof of worth, proof of belonging. Proof that I was ever enough for a man who spent most of his life pretending I wasn't there. That day in the chapel wasn't my reckoning, it was my release. The strange thing about being erased is that, for a while, you start doing it to yourself, you whisper less, you shrink in doorways. You hesitate before speaking, always scanning the room for permission that never comes. You learn to celebrate yourself quietly, as if joy is something you might get in trouble for. I spent years thinking I was the one who needed to change. That maybe if I was just a little quieter, a little more agreeable, they would remember I existed. But now I see it clearly. It wasn't my volume, it was their silence. Silence can be violent. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that lingers, that cuts in absence, in empty seats, in unreturned calls. In birthdays passed without a single word. That's what I grew up in, not hatred, just nothing. And nothing, over time, feels like poison. But the antidote isn't revenge, it's presence. I learned that when I walked to the front of the chapel and handed that envelope to the lawyer. I wasn't trying to win. I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I was simply refusing to disappear one more time. People ask me now, was it worth it? To stand up in front of them. To face a woman who took your place at the table. In the photos, in his final days. And I always say the same thing, I didn't do it for them. I did it for the girl I used to be. The one who sat on the stairs listening to laughter downstairs, and wondering if she'd ever be invited to join. I did it so she would know that one day, someone would stand up for her, even if it had to be her older, scarred, stronger self. I don't need the family name. I don't need the inheritance. I don't need a single soul in that room to apologize. What I needed was to be real, in my own eyes. To take back the chapters they tried to write without me, and to walk away with nothing but my spine intact, and I did. I walk different now. Not with arrogance, but with assurance. I speak softer. But I mean every word. I laugh deeper. I love better because I know the cost of absence. I know what it means to be unseen, unheard, unwanted. And to choose yourself anyway. I kept the suit I wore to the funeral. It wasn't expensive. But I keep it as a reminder, not of death, but of arrival. That was the day I stepped into the story they tried to end without me. That was the day I said, actually, I'm here, and meant it, not just to them, but to myself. Camille, 29. Daughter, not just by blood, but by voice, by memory, by truth, and this is mine now.